This is easily the most frightening thing to ever happen to me in my life. I grew up out in the country. My family lived out on a ridge. We had a very large extended family who was scattered all throughout the entire tri-state area. This being the case, I was generally pretty used to the rural settings and was never really afraid of it, even though it tends to get much darker, and I know many people find the darkness of the country to be quite scary in itself. I never really did, though. But of course, this story takes place in the dark, and it's pretty scary as well. I had been over at my aunt's house babysitting my cousins while she was working the second shift at work. She got home pretty late and offered me to remain over and to sleep the night there. I was really tired, though. I was also never the type of person who was ever able to really get a good sleep at anyone else's house, so I declined the offer. I set out on my way home. I had only recently begun driving at all, much less driving places I'm not familiar with in any way, and although I had driven to my aunt's house in the past, it was never this late at night. What I had to do, since my aunt lived in an adjacent state, was get down off the hill that she lived on. I would then take a gravel road out to a paved route, which would eventually get me to town. I would then head for the bridge that would take me over the river, back into my own state. I had been driving for a while, thinking that everything was fine. You know how a lot of times when you get lost, you don't really realize that you're lost at first, but then you slowly begin to realize that you've been driving around for a bit and notice it's taking you longer to get to the place than you assumed where you were going. Well, that is exactly what happened to me on this night. I was trying to get down off the hill, like I mentioned to you, but strangely, at one point, the road turned, and I realized I was suddenly going back uphill. At that point, I realized I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. Obviously, I should not have been going back uphill at any point during that drive. At first, being lost didn't really bother me too much. I figured I'd just find a quick place to turn around in, and then I would be able to make it back to where I had been trying to go in the first place. However, as I kept on driving, I realized there were not exactly a lot of driveways to just turn around in, and the road I was driving on was way too skinny for me to do a 3-point turnabout on the road. Hell, it was way too skinny to even have a car traveling in the opposite direction. The only driveways that I had passed at that point were gated off, and there was not much room for me to turn around in them. Still, I wasn't completely worried. I mean, like I mentioned, I didn't find the darkness of the country to be particularly scary. I grew up in it my whole life. I knew that if I just kept on my way, I would eventually find a way to turn around and get back to the road I needed to. I wasn't worried at all. But then, I saw something up ahead of me. I slowed down just a bit, because I noticed it was a person, a man, walking down the road all by himself. He was walking on the inner part of the road, on the very narrow strip of land between the hill and roadway. He didn't have a flashlight or anything, which meant he was walking alone in the pitch dark before my headlights had fallen on him. I slowed down a little bit, mostly because I didn't want to actually hurt the guy by accidentally running him over. I began wondering if I should ask him if he needed help, or any assistance. For some reason, though, I immediately disliked that idea of asking if he needed help. He was a man walking all alone on a dark country road on a hill, in the middle of the night without any equipment. It was just strange, and I decided it would just be best to stay out of it and continue on my way. As I passed him, though, I saw him staring at me through the windshield. When I was going right past him, he rushed and grabbed onto the handle of my car door, trying to pull it open. Fortunately, the door was locked, so he wasn't able to pry it open. He began pounding on the window of the door extremely hard, like he was trying to break it open. The man also began yelling at me, but I was too freaked out to really hear anything he had to say. In my panic, I stomped on the gas and tried my best to get away. Since I was going uphill, this was a dangerous thing to do, as the road was extremely curvy, but at the moment that wasn't exactly my major concern. At first, the guy kept up with me, but soon I was able to speed up to a point that he had to stop his pursuit. I managed to break away from him. I was so freaked out about what happened that I had to change my entire strategy to find me a way off the hill. I didn't want to turn around at that point, because then I would have to go back down the hill past that guy, and that was not something I wanted to do. I kept on driving, hoping the road didn't dead end. It didn't, but it did lead me to a few roads I was not familiar with. It took me a long time to find my way back to a place I was, and eventually I did end up getting home. Extremely late, of course, but at least I was safe. I don't know who that guy was, what he wanted, or even why he was out there, but I'm happy I never got the chance to find out. When I was 18, I was going to beauty college and lived in a trailer in a pretty sketchy trailer park. It was cheap and I needed a home at the time. One evening, while I was home, I glanced out my window and happened to notice a man across the road from my trailer. He was smoking and pacing back and forth, right beside someone else's house that was a part of the park. It was extremely dark out, and he was not at their door, but near the side of their house. I closed my curtains, somewhat afraid. I didn't know what he was doing, and I didn't know the situation either. Whatever it was, he sure was interested in something in that house. He was forgotten, though, after he walked away, until a few evenings later. I looked out, and sure enough, he was there again, repeatedly walking, waiting, and chain-smoking. I decided I wanted to see what he was up to exactly, so I kept a keen eye out on him this time. Time passed by, and eventually a light came on in the room above him. The blind was raised a bit at the window. The man stood below it. I surmised this was probably a bedroom window. He raised himself up and stood on something, so he could be tall enough to stare into it. I didn't have a phone at the time, so I couldn't call anyone, and I was too afraid to confront the man on my own. I was still an immature young girl at the time. The next day, though, I walked right over to the landlord's office and told them what I had seen. I told them all about the guy and his seeming window peeking. They weren't surprised and didn't seem to care at all. He lived there in the park, and he happened to be good friends with them. Oh, him? He does that when he and his wife have a fight sometimes and she leaves. Wait, so you're telling me it's okay to rent to someone that peeks into other people's windows and be friends with them too? My jaw dropped. I was stunned. I went over to the house where I'd seen this happening and knocked on the door. A young woman answered. I told her about the pervert who had been looking into her windows and what had been happening outside her house the past few days. She said nothing. I think she was too shocked and afraid to, or maybe she just thought I was making it up. That night I stayed on watch, though. The blind was pulled down in the window this time. Nothing to see anymore. Good. So, no guy skulking around. Okay, it's over, I thought. That was the end of it. No. I came home late one evening, and the man was standing there on my porch. I sat in my car trying to think. I had nowhere to go but there. I think the landlord probably told the guy I'd seen him, and what he'd done. The man suddenly jumped off my porch and ran around the back of my trailer. It was overgrown back there with high weeds and shrubbery, and was a good hiding place. I jumped out of my car and made a dash for my porch. I ran inside, terrified. I crawled through my trailer to my bedroom, crying, with no one to help me to see if this guy was gone or even what he was doing. Since he lived there in the trailer park, I felt hopeless to tell anyone. After all, I had already found out he was well connected, and no one cared what he did. I even told an aunt of mine about it all. She said he just wanted to look. Was everyone else crazy, or was I? Had he been looking into my windows as well? Yes, I thought. I made the decision to move back to my mom's in another state. The last night that I was there, I sat in the dark watching TV, still leery of the guy. I spotted him walking up the sidewalk from the trailer park. He stopped and was staring up at the lit windows of a 2-story house, skulking around again. I was so happy to get out of there. No one ever confronted him, no police ever came. To this day, he's probably still peering into people's unsuspecting windows. My brother Rick and I, along with a couple of our friends, Dale and Joey, decided that because this was the last week of summer vacation, we would get our Stingray bicycles out and ride to High Trestle, a part timber and steel railroad trestle built back in the 30s. It crossed a precipitous ravine around a massive bluff about 3 miles southwest of town. It was called High Trestle because its highest point was about 100 feet above the ground. The trestle was also known for its length, at nearly a quarter of a mile. It curved around the bluff in such a way as to reduce visibility or detection at the last minute. It proved time and time again to take its grisly toll on anything and everything too slow to respond or caught by surprise. Even the single railroad crossing whose gravel roads serviced the farms north and south of the trestle would report automobile or tractor casualties when the train would barrel unseen and unheard eastbound from around the bluff. If you were on foot, you had only 2 options, and that was to either try and run or jump. For those unfortunate enough to have to choose, the gruesome result would always be there later for someone to find. Deer, coyotes, foxes, weasels, raccoons, cows, horses, dogs, cats, snakes, snapper turtles, and the occasional unwary human ventured out beyond the point of no return. They would get caught and either mowed down on the tracks, shoved off by the locomotive, or forced to jump into the gaping ravine below. Few survived the train or the plunge, and the remains would eventually be found either on the tracks above or broken on the ground, hanging on the support timbers occasionally that jabbed up like spikes in a bear pit below. Some timbers sported a length of 40 to 50 feet and looked like a creosote-soaked petrified forest from above. They were still used for anchors or support in the construction and maintenance of the trestle. Our reason for going out there was always that maybe this time we'd find some hobo or gypsy or bank robber's bloodied and dismembered corpse strung out over a quarter acre, or maybe even some of the money one of the robbers had gotten away with while hiding out or making their getaway after knocking over the Mitchellville Savings and Loan Bank earlier that year. We never did find any actual human remains, but imagining the possibility almost always proved to be too much to resist. We were never, either together or alone, too shy or afraid of looking for stuff like that. It was just one of the many brainstorm ideas we had living in a small rural farm town in the early 1960s. Once we reached the trestle, the drill was to hide our bikes in some of the brush along the side, just in case someone from one of the nearby farms decided to teach us another lesson on 5-finger discounts. We'd made that mistake earlier, when another friend had gotten his bike stolen, and we all had to walk the 3.5 miles home. Likewise, we knew better than to take the bikes across, because we'd made that mistake once before too, and had to throw them off into the ravine and run like hell before the train mowed us off them. In that time, a fast-moving freighter nearly caught us when it suddenly and silently rolled around the bluff. Despite our age and barely passing marks in arithmetic and math, we somehow knew enough the amount of track and time it took for a 60-car fully laden freighter to cover the quarter mile across the trestle and come to a complete stop at 50 miles per hour. The rule was, if you had to cross it, always do it during the day, because then you could see to avoid it, but if it was at night, you would never see the light or hear the horn in time before it was suddenly upon you. Nobody wanted to end up like some of the victims we'd find, but being a young kid in a small town meant that you were always looking for something, whether forking hay with a pitchfork and a baling machine, cutting trees with a chainsaw and splitting the lengths into firewood with a 2-headed axe, or getting caught in a fire drill at school where all the kids in the upper floors had to descend a rickety old fire escape that turned out to be more dangerous than any actual or imaginary fire. It was all more or less like the proverbial watermelon, never tasting as sweet as when it was stolen from the neighbor's garden. Life in a small rural town without danger wasn't really living, and adventure without risk wasn't worth talking about. Once we reached the edge of the ravine and the beginning of the trestle, I could see the deepening shadow and the thin stream meandering its way down and out to the corn or soy, or whatever clover fields further south. I could feel the hot summer wind wafting up from below, and the hot summer sun baking my face and hands. I can still smell the tar and creosote on the ties and rail bed. Such as it was, looking back, it was like a little piece of heaven. We all knew that our only real choice lay in crossing the tracks above, because to descend into the ravine on this side was not only more treacherous, but also would add a lot more time onto an already rapidly dwindling day. Besides, where's the adventure in that? Fingering the chunks of rock flaked with pyrite I'd picked up along the tracks earlier, we made our way to the trestle. I imagined the rocks were magically endowed with some foreknowledge of things to come, and chuckled. Maybe it was another reason they called it fool's gold. Being the eldest, I asked everyone if they wanted to cross the tracks or go down. It would be quicker crossing the tracks, but it would also mean staying along the edge and a sheer drop to avoid the splits between the ties, while at the same time avoiding the bolt heads along the entire length, not tripping or falling off along the way. We all agreed on the tracks and stopped for one last moment to check ourselves, say a little prayer, and listen for any sound or vibration that would signal there was a freighter approaching. With all that out of the way, we beat it across. Some of us on one rail and some on the other. Back then, whenever I would take the tracks home from school, I would always walk/balance on one rail as far as I could before falling off. Sometimes I'd keep from falling by jumping from one to the other. At other times I would count the ties in threes. 3, 6, 9, 12, standing on one and jumping to 3, etc., until I lost count. I did the same thing here. Sometimes crossing between rails, counting the ties, avoiding the gaps and balancing on each one, while running as far as I could without falling off. The 15 minutes it took to cross felt like 60, and we counted ourselves lucky, blessed, and not a little crazy. But that was all right, because we thought, live to fight another day. For most of us, to fight who or what didn't extend much, beyond the class bully who'd push the younger kids down on the playground, steal a swing belonging to someone else, or jump off the teeter-totter when somebody was on it. Seems like there's always at least one of those in every school. What, were they specially appointed? Elected? Just volunteers, maybe? It didn't really matter, because to us, bozos like him could never imagine what we did, let alone cross High Trestle, or make the ride it took to get there. All bullying and no play makes Jack a fat creep. And once we reached the other side, still panting and victorious, we climbed down to the creek, washed off the diesel dust and creosote, and looked for snapper turtles, searched for new victims, avoid the poison ivy, generally just hang out, until we decided to begin the journey back up and out for home. Finally, we began the ascent on the same side we descended, because the opposite was mostly vertical, and the soil extremely loose and wet from the rain the night before. Rather than crossing back on the rails again, and taking our chances with an oncoming train, we thought it would be safer and more fun to cross on the iron skirting that ran along the underside of the rail bed, just below the tracks. Since we were all still short and not yet our full height, we were able to scooch along under the rail, holding on to the upper fluted skirting with our hands, and the lower with our red ball jets. We passed the first girder at approximately 40 feet from the edge and 20 feet from the ground, silently, slowly, and patiently making our way to the next. The next put us about 100 feet from the edge and 40 feet off the ground. When we reached the 180 feet from the edge and 60 feet from the ground section, I was suddenly distracted by the sound of human chatter behind and south of us, downstream from the creek. Nobody else was supposed to be out here. We'd always made a point of not letting anyone else know. Secrecy was an essential element of our adventures. We didn't want anyone else to know apart from those who were invited, and they were sworn to secrecy or permanently banned. If our parents found out anything about what we were doing, we'd never be able to do anything again. We'd be perpetually grounded, hence the urgency of who was out there and how they had found out. Bracing my feet and hands on the edging, I craned my head back behind me to see who it was and what was going on. I discovered that it was Curtis, my once best friend but now worst enemy, because he tried to get me into a fight with Paul over a lie he'd told Paul about me. I began yelling at Curtis and his fellow thugs to get out of here, because he was no longer my friend, and I didn't want anything to do with him, when, trying to see behind me, I shifted my weight onto my left foot while surging along the flute with my right. My foot caught on the edge of a large bolt, throwing my weight sideways, spinning me around and forcing me to let go with both hands and jump out onto a 12 by 12 horizontal support beam that was nearly 6 stories above the ground and was holding up the skirt and track on this side of the trestle. Because my weight was now leaning forward, I instinctively hopped down onto a second and longer 12 by 12 support beam. Still off balance, I leapt deliberately and reflexively off the trestle. As I was falling, the rocks with the fool's gold in my jacket pockets and the uprush of air at first suspended everything above me like a makeshift parachute. I pulled my arms down and out using the jacket to catch as much wind as possible, thinking it might somehow slow my descent. Falling, I thought of all the stories about some old hobos or gypsies that had fallen off or jumped because they'd been taken unaware by one of the night trains, pitching them headlong into the ground or onto the jabbing forest of support poles below. As I started to scream, I thought I must have nearly reached maximum velocity. I made a point of trying to fall straight down, feet first. I imagined using my billowing jacket to keep me from tumbling and guide me between the creosote poles, some as thick as tree trunks jutting out of the ground below me. Somehow I managed to accomplish both, but once I hit the ground, the impact sank me up to my pelvis in the soft black topsoil that had eroded from the edges of the ravine, and consequently knocked all of the air completely out of me. Gasping for breath, my brother and our friends moved quickly back across the skirting and down the side, screaming and crying. They thought I was dead or dying. Later, my brother Rick told me that the only word I uttered was calling for my mama. Curtis and some of his henchmen tried to come over, but my brother called them off for having caused it in the first place, and shortly thereafter they left. The sun started to set, but all I could think about was this savage pain in my back, leg, and arms. All had taken the brunt of the concussion, yet miraculously it seemed no bones were broken, just torn muscles and tendons. On the way home I tried to ride my bike, but the pain was so great that all I could do was lean on my brother or one of our other friends, take a few steps and fall immediately, or occasionally lean on the bike, take a few steps and then fall face first, slowly traversing that 3.5 miles home. It took nearly 4 hours to get there. When I got back, my mother wasn't there, so my older brother called her after drawing me a hot-as-I-could-take-it bath with Epsom salts. She apparently said she was too busy and hung up. She was probably at her bridge club. My mother and I were never close. When she finally did get home, she said it was my own fault and I had to live with the consequences. In spite of her, I took her advice and did. Taking me to a doctor somehow never occurred to her, but it did occur to my brother. He was so mad at her disregard, he called her a selfish bitch to her face and earned a pretty hard slap for it. For weeks I couldn't stand, except for short jaunts across the room, or from a chair to bed. I'd get a lot of reading in, though. Most kids would have relished an extended vacation, but for me, being home with her was far worse than anything bullies of the world could conjure up. It took 2 weeks of sleeplessness, pain, and fear, but I was determined that I would walk again. When I got back to school, my classmates thought I was kind of a hero, because I was the only person they had ever heard of who had fallen off that high trestle and lived. For months that fall haunted me. Of course, my mother told me to never go out there again, but I knew I had to, or I would be afraid forever, and so she would win. I somehow knew revisiting the trestle was the only way to conquer my fear and end this terror. It had to be done. One day, after delivering the Saturday morning register to the 24 homes on my route, I went back out on my bike by myself. I walked the entire length across and back. No trains came. Going back there was one of the most difficult things I had ever done. I remember the autumn wind blowing particularly hard against me all the way there. It was as though it was trying to knock me off my bike, and then off the trestle when I crossed as well. As though it was furious at me for getting away and having the audacity to come back. At one point I thought I heard my mother's screams, as though she thought I were taunting her. Nonetheless, all the way back home, I took the return wind as an affirmation. I practically flew all the way there. I think she must have known, when after the beating from my stepfather for being late, she asked if I had gone back there. Of course I lied and said I hadn't. I'd learned a long time past that telling my mother the truth about anything, let alone talking to her about my thoughts or dreams, always resulted in verbal or physical abuse. Growing up, I lived with this belief that if I mostly just kept my mouth shut and answered yes or no questions, just did what I had to without her or anyone else knowing, I could avoid a lot of the pain, abuse, and heartache. That whether she or anyone else approved or not, it didn't matter. One way or the other though, whether justified or not, I knew I was always going to pay a price for it. I believed the fall was, up until then, the price. At a fairly early age, I knew my mother was mad, and my stepfather a drunken brute. In spite of them, I had to survive to fight another day. Unbeknownst to almost everybody outside my immediate family, there was more than just bullies at school to contend with. All those years, despite the constant fear of pain and punishment, whether for real or imagined transgressions, I somehow knew instinctively what had to be done, at least for myself and my little brother. Over the years, I had learned to adapt to the circumstances at home, school, the playground, or on the street. I had developed a high tolerance for physical, mental, and emotional pain. I imagined myself stoically invulnerable to almost anything. But the truth is, no one is invulnerable. For all the pain and hurt one suppressed throughout their life, it will come back one day to haunt you. Somebody once said that everything you've ever felt, tasted, heard, smelled, seen, learned, or experienced is never forgotten. It's all there just under the surface, as fresh and clear and sharp as the day it happened. Somebody else once said that at the time of death or near death, all your life will flash before you. Many of us experienced that while growing up. Some of my schoolmates and friends lived to tell the tale, but others didn't. To me, the most important thing in all of this is to always remember and never forget what it is somebody else once said. In times like these, you learn who your real friends are. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you guys liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. That sort of stuff really helps me out with the audience engagement and really helps my videos get out to a lot more people. So hopefully we can get to that 1 million one day. Help me out, guys. That'd be great. Once again, starting this week on the second channel, we're going to be doing some true crime stuff. Probably twice a week if I feel in the mood for it and feel like doing all the research required. Those will be on Wednesdays/Thursdays and Saturdays/Sundays probably. So look forward to that if you're interested. There's a link to my second channel in the description. The name is Mr. Blue Sky, so keep an eye out for that. If you guys feel like contacting me for any reason, links to all of my social media will be in the description below, including my Facebook, Twitter, and Gmail accounts. Send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please make sure that it has proper grammar, and try to include as much detail as possible so it's long enough for me to include in a video. Also, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is, if it has one, what type of story it is, if it has a theme, and how you would like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. If you guys are curious about the art used in this video, links to my artist, Alan, will be in the description below. He does a lot of horror art stuff, and he's really good at it. He also does commissions, so if you guys have any projects you want to work on or something, please be sure to check him out. He can probably get you something really good. As usual, links to the music used in the video will be in the description below in the order which it appears. I think that's pretty much all for now, guys, so thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.
Good evening all and welcome. Got a few announcements, so I'm just going to drop them here before the video begins. Number one, I've been absent for the last 2 days. I apologize for this. On Monday and Tuesday, I had the paneling put into the studio room, and I do think it has improved the quality of the sound. However, they stuck it with silicone, so it smells of really strong vinegar, and it took a few days for the smell to finally dissipate, which it's finally done. Yesterday I was going to try and record anyway, but unfortunately Pandora didn't have her nap, and it was a challenging day as a parent, so it couldn't be done. Also, as some of you may be aware, I'm working on a secret project, and I got the prototype for it today, which was very lovely. Unfortunately, the quality wasn't quite what I was expecting. It was subpar, and I was left quite disappointed, to be honest. So I'm going to have to find someone else who might be able to do a better job if this is going to happen at all. So yeah, all enigmas for now. What isn't an enigma is tonight's video. I also have the pleasure of welcoming Daughter of Darkness again for a collaboration. If you enjoy her voice, please feel free to check her out. A link will be in the description and to a video at the very end. But for now, thank you for listening. It's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I live in the valley of Sacramento, California, a few miles from the American River. This particular river is only a short walk away from a vintage part of my town, where there is absolutely nothing but chickens and a family-owned business. My first job was a family-owned coffee shop when I was 16 in this little town. To give you some backstory, now a lot of the homeless folk often flocked to the rivers and would often wander into my shop. I dealt with the odd bodies on and off almost every day without a care. However, there was one weirdo I remember vividly enough that it still makes me sit and wonder. When I was new to the shop, it took some time to get to know the regulars and remember their names. I had a lot of faces to memorize. One face in particular, for some reason, sat in my mind far above the others. A stout, bald man with a wide nose and thinly timmed glasses. He wasn't quite old, but he wasn't the youngest man I'd met. He would stand outside of my store for about 10 minutes every day before coming in to stand in the back of the cafe and watch me and my other co-workers clean and make coffee. Sometimes he wouldn't order anything, but when he did, he would always get a small black coffee and a small serving of potato salad. He would always ask for napkins and would always ask for a pen. After ordering, he would proceed to write things down on one of the napkins, leave his empty coffee cup on a table, and take his food out the door, where he would stand and watch us pick up his trash. I noticed over time that he seemed to look irritated when I wasn't the one to do it. Every time he did this, he would leave small notes in poor, rough handwriting, and would then throw away his salad outside. His notes were more person. At first I thought of it as nothing more than a sweet thank you. I often write small notes to serve as on receipts from time to time, things like wonderful day and thank you. But these slowly morphed. Beautiful day, take a break, I'm outside. You look lovely today, love your hair. My co-workers would make a gag out of the notes if they weren't thrown away before reading one. Once I assumed he figured out that the other girls were the ones grabbing them. He began to leave them on one end of the counter where my espresso machine was. You make me happy, Kian, one of them read. I still don't know how he learned my name or who asked, but I presume one of my co-workers on a day I was off. I began to get increasingly uncomfortable whenever he would stand outside and watch me work, or when he would order from my till. I could only smile and thank him as I got his coffee and salad, in my customer service voice. The next part is where it gets interesting. One week towards the end of the summer, he worked his routine of window shopping before ordering, asking for napkins and a pen, and going about his letter. However, he did not ask for a pen nor napkins, but proceeded to only ask for the coffee. He left to the restroom. I forgot how long he was in there, since I myself took my lunch break as soon as the order was done. When I returned, I was told that someone had left their cup in the restroom. and it had been emptied and left on top of the toilet. It was filled with semen. I don't know if it was him, but the timing was too close to not assume. I didn't see him for a while because I had traded my early starts for closing shifts. The last time I saw him, he came in late. I presume he either found out by stalking or asking my co-workers why I was no longer a morning maid. He asked me kindly for a cup of coffee and potato salad, a pen and a napkin. I obliged, but I was hardly enthusiastic. The routine went normally. He drank his coffee, sat and wrote, left it on the counter without looking up, and walked out into the night. He didn't stop to watch. He didn't throw away his salad. You're lovely every time. Thank you for the smiles. Leave the glitter to the blondes. I don't know what this means. You're a young flower amongst the sunset. Billy. After that, I never saw him come into the store or lurk outside the window. I don't often lend out pens as much as I used to. So creepy poetry napkin guy, let's not meet.
This happened when I was 14 years old. My high school is down the street from a shopping center. It's normally pretty busy, mostly because there's a McDonald's and Walmart that most kids go to after school. The Walmart only carried groceries, so it didn't attract your typical Walmart type. On the day this all went down, my friend and I decided to walk to McDonald's after school to grab a bite to eat. I decided I wanted to stop at Walmart to buy some canned goods to donate to the hurricane relief victims. Since we had come directly from school and neither of us were old enough to drive, we still had our backpacks on us. I'm paranoid of being accused of stealing because I'm black and I definitely do not live in the most progressive of areas, to say the least. So I left my backpack outside with my friend and went inside alone. Now here's where it all went downhill. I walked inside and went straight for the canned goods. I was deciding what to buy when I saw an old man of about 70 or 80 years old, not walking, but hobbling towards me. I assumed he just needed to buy something in that aisle, so I gave him a polite smile and went back to my shopping. But then I realized that this guy's eyes were trained on me, and the closer he got, the more obvious it was that he was trying to talk to me. I was a little weirded out at that point, but I assumed he was harmless. I was wrong. He stopped right next to me, and I turned to acknowledge him. He had this horrible fake smile on his face. Laughing, he said to me, "You know why I come to Walmart? To look at the beautiful girls like you." At that point, I was actually scared. My mind started racing, trying to think what I should do. Should I yell for help? Ignore him? Be rude? I had no clue. Ultimately, I just politely said thank you, hoping that it would satisfy him and he'd go away. Wrong again. He began chatting me up, flirting with me. He asked me some things that I don't remember. Then he asked the golden question. "So, how old are you?" I thought, this is it. When I tell him, he'll back off after he knows how underage I really am. This would be my ticket out of this conversation. Except, when I told him I was just 14, he cocked his head and his smile got even wider. 14, you say? I thought you were 17. He was even more interested in me after finding out that I was younger than he thought. At that point, I was nearly in tears, but I was still too damn nice and afraid to tell him to leave me alone. So I just humored him, nodded and smiled until he left. I was mortified. I felt dirty and violated, and mad at myself for not having the guts to tell him to leave me alone. After he was gone, I walked over to the customer service desk, and I told them what happened. I said how he kept hitting on me even after assuming and then knowing for a fact that I was underage. At that point, I was hysterical. But the customer service guy had the nerve to tell me that they couldn't do anything at all, not even ask the guy to leave the store. So I left without buying anything, and I went back to my friend and told her what happened. My friend did not take this lightly, and she went inside to try to reason with the customer service guy, but to no avail. We decided to just leave and call my mom to come get us. When she arrived, I told her everything, and by some stroke of luck, the old guy was walking out of the store just as we were going inside to talk to the customer service guy yet again. When I pointed him out to my mom, she let loose. The entire wrath of an angry black mother was released on this poor, unsuspecting old white dude. And the dummy actually defended himself by saying, "I didn't know she was only 14. Nice save, jerk." So, to the predator at Walmart, let's not meet again.
A little backstory in order for all of this to make a bit more sense. I used to live in New York City in a tiny apartment full of 6 other people and me, so 7 in total. We dubbed ourselves the team. I was the youngest at 19 and was treated like all little sisters, as everyone else was 26 to 35. I'm also pretty tiny, standing at 5'2", and not even 115 pounds soaking wet. This particular instance involved my giant 6'5" weightlifter roommate from Africa that I called Moo. During the summer, I worked at a little hole-in-the-wall coffee shop on the Upper East Side. Contrary to popular belief, the highest crime rate was the Upper East Side. I would close on a few nights out the week with another worker that absolutely hated my guts called Fatima. I only agreed to close on the night she worked the late shift because I got to bring home the bagels that wouldn't sell and would give these out, otherwise they'd be thrown away. On my walk home, which was about a 30-minute walk, I would give a bag of bagels to a nice homeless man. I called him Bagel Guy, and he called me Coffee Girl. And now is where the story begins. Earlier in the day that I closed with my coworker Fatima, a man had come in and ordered coffee, which isn't unusual in itself because I worked in a coffee shop. What made him stand out was that I had never seen him before, and neither had my coworkers. The coffee shop was one of those places with regulars that would have their orders being made the second they stepped into the door, and everyone knew them by name or at least recognized them. I brushed it off as maybe he was exploring or had recently moved into the area. But as the line steadily shrunk, I was noticing that he was staring bullets at me. At first, I wasn't too worried. After all, I lived in New York City, and there was an overtly fair amount of awkward and unusual characters. Only this guy was blatantly staring bullets at me, to the point where I could feel his eyes on me when I turned around to grab people's orders. When it was his turn to order, I mentioned that I hadn't seen him in the shop before, and he replied that he had stopped in because he saw me at the window. Okay. Again, it's New York City. People do weird stuff. He ordered, he paid, but he kept hanging around the counter trying to get my attention and to speak to me. I politely told him that I was busy and that he'd need to grab a seat or clear out because I needed to work. Mind you, this place was literally like a closet. The only people that would ever sit at the 2.5 tables we had were the guy that cleaned and ran our pickups, or one of the 3 people that had been coming to the shop since the dawn of time itself. This strange guy hung around nearly all day, sometimes outside or at the table when a seat was available, but he was never out of sight for more than 30 to 45 minutes. I was starting to get weirded out at this point that I voluntarily talked to Fatima, even though she despised me. So much so to the point she'd yell at me in front of customers and complain loudly to the managers about me. I told her the weird guy had been bugging me all day and didn't listen when I told him that I couldn't just loiter. Fatima didn't care. When closing time came around, we would usually be done around 11:30 to midnight. I was tasked with going to grab our little sign and bench that we had outside. So I go out, and guess who's there? That's right, the weirdo. I tell him that we are closing, and that I needed to bring the bench inside. He gets off the bench and walks off. I watch him turn the corner at the end of the street, but I'm still weirded out. I mentioned it to Fatima and asked her if she'd stay with me because I wanted my roommate Moo to come and get me. But she doesn't care. I grab my bags of leftover bagels and she locks up and gets out of there towards one of the subway stations uptown. My apartment was downtown, so I couldn't have walked with her anyway. As I'm walking, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being followed, and decided to turn quickly and without warning to see if I am. Turns out I was. Every time I'd turn around, this guy would quickly try to hide in a doorway like the stereotypical creeper in a movie, doubling back, switching avenues, and trying to lose him by hiding in groups of people didn't help. I know many people are going to think, why didn't I call someone? You see, my hands were full, and I was trying not to trip or panic. Remember Bagel Guy? This is where he makes an appearance. I'd always be bringing him bagels and we'd have a chat. I finally reach where Bagel Guy usually is and say hi and hand him his share of the bagels. I tell him that I'm being followed and tell him that he's hiding badly in a doorway. Bagel Guy sees the creep and tells me to stay where I am and to call someone. Moo was the only person I could reach. I had acted like my phone rang and was kind of talking in shorthand to him about the creep and that I was with Bagel Guy. Moo was still a ways downtown, but said that he was hurrying, and I asked Bagel Guy if he'd walk with me to meet my roommate because I was scared out of my mind, and he agreed and said it was no problem. We start our walk downtown towards my roommate, and the whole time the creeper is still following. He's even doing the whole horribly fail at trying to hide shtick, but he's getting closer and closer every time we turn to look. But there's still no sign of Moo and I want to cry. Finally, we see a beast of a man just barreling towards us and I immediately recognize it as Moo. I guess he had seen the guy following me and now Bagel Guy, because Moo doesn't stop as he reaches us, he just kept on running. Bagel Guy and I decide to jog towards where Moo was heading, and I was glad I did. When Moo reached the creep, he shoved past him against the wall where he was hiding and confronted him about following his little sister. I guess I should note that I looked nothing like Moo. The creepy guy is now the one scared out of his mind. He has this 6'5" ripped guy that's nearly breathing fire at him. Moo threatened the guy that if he catches him following us again after this, or following me, or coming to the coffee shop, that the creep is going to regret it severely. I was a little taken aback. Moo is a giant teddy bear, but he's not someone you want to be on the bad side of. After Moo was done scaring the guy, he thanked Bagel Guy many times for watching out for me and hoped he enjoyed his bagels. Then Moo and I got home. Unfortunately, I was never bothered by that creep again.
I seem to attract a lot of creepy guys. I don't know if it's because I'm petite and look like I won't fight back, or because I'm mistaken for sweet and endearing when people don't realize that they're just getting my customer service face. I get followed frequently, and I've had a few different stalkers. It's exacerbated by the fact that I tend to be a bit clueless at first when someone's being creepy. The following story is one of my more interesting encounters. I worked at Starbucks for a while, one that's located inside of a Target store. The manager wanted us to create personal connections with the customers by learning their names and making small talk. While I'm not great with names, I do have a very good eye for faces and for remembering which faces order what drinks. So one day, a guy with a bunch of tattoos walked up to the counter. I used the tattoos as a talking point, and I nicknamed him John the Tattoo Guy. He always ordered a venti white chocolate mocha. After that first day, he started coming in 3 to 4 times a week. One day, he paused, stared at me, and said, "Have you been avoiding me?" I laughed. At the time, I didn't know anything was wrong. So I said, "No, I've just been at school a lot." He nodded and walked off. After he walked away, my co-worker whispered to me, "He's been coming in here every single day looking for you. He even checks under the counters." Well, that did concern me a bit, but then I thought, maybe the guy just has a social disorder, and that makes him a little awkward. He came back about a week later. I was having a conversation with another customer about donating blood. I've always been a firm believer in donating blood, even though I'm afraid of needles. Without missing a beat, John the tattoo guy joined in the conversation and said, "I can't donate blood." I said, "Oh, why not? Are you afraid of needles too?" "No," he said. "I have hepatitis C. But don't worry, you can't get it from me unless we have really rough sex." Now, keep in mind, before this, I only had very basic 2-sentence conversations with this guy. I looked at him, gave a nervous laugh, and went back to my work. Right after that, the store security guard came over to talk to me. I thought he must have overheard the conversation and was coming to help me out. But it turns out that John the tattoo guy was actually stealing from the area Target stores, and the security guy wanted me to flirt with him to find out where he lived. So, John and my old security guard, let's not meet again.
A friend of mine was telling me some stories about a Starbucks location she worked at, and this one really bummed me out. There are usually homeless people in that area, and most are relatively harmless. She and her co-workers noticed a grisly-looking man hovering around, and soon saw that he had a hunting knife in his belt, but that's legal in my state. I believe this is what got the cops called, but at some point during the encounter he borrowed an employee's phone and went to the bathroom. He then returned the phone and leaves. The employee checks the bathroom expecting to find needles or something, but also expecting to find drugs stashed somewhere, which happens apparently. Checking under the sink and inside a PVC pipe, she finds an SD card, plugs it in, and it is completely full of porn. I'm told they noped out of there immediately and called the police, so the details aren't known. I shared it here, but can't stop imagining the terrible underground network of people using dead drops to trade what has to be horrifying and almost certainly inappropriate sexual material, i.e. underage, in broad daylight.
One time I was in Starbucks before meeting up with my boyfriend. I ordered, then sat down at the table to wait for my drink. I have a very strong resting bitch face when I'm in public alone. I'm only 5 feet tall and 100 pounds, so I use it to keep creeps away. This day, however, it didn't work. My boyfriend was held up at the military processing facility. He had just joined the Navy, so I was having a friend pick me up and bring me to him. As I sat there waiting, this creepy guy came over to me out of nowhere and introduced himself. I tensed up as soon as he sat down across the table from me. He said he didn't want to seem weird because he'd been staring at me, and he decided the best thing to do was come talk to me so I'd know he was okay. He said I seemed like I was a cool girl and he wanted to get to know me. He asked if I was a student because I had a backpack with me. I told him no. He asked if I had a job, and I said, not at the moment. I was trying to give very short answers, all the while giving whoever I could make eye contact with that help me look. He asked if I was local and if I drove a car there. I simply replied, Uber. He asked if I had a boyfriend, and I said, yes, actually I'm engaged, and my fiancé is in the Navy. He looked down at my left hand and saw the ring. He told me that he had friends in the military. I didn't respond. I never made eye contact with him, but I made a mental note of everything about him. He was of average size and weight, with a narrow jaw and terrible brown teeth. He told me he was a writer working on a book, and he also offered me a ride. But I said, no thank you, I have someone coming to pick me up. He finally left me alone after playing 20 questions. I got my drink and went outside to a table where I didn't think he could see me. I was texting my friends trying to get one to call me, when the next thing I knew, Mr. Creepy Guy comes and sits down across the table from me, again. This time he offered me a job typing his manuscript. He said he'd pay me $20 an hour cash. I declined, but he kept going on about how we should meet up and he could pay me, and he told me he would give me a ride whenever I needed one. He also told me he was a photographer and a web designer. I told him that I couldn't accept any offers because my fiancé would not be okay with that. He offered to leave me his number so my fiancé could call and talk to him, but I told him no. He then asked if my fiancé was strict with me. I said, no, he's just protective. He asked for my number, and I said, my fiancé definitely would not be okay with that. He insisted that he wasn't trying to break up my relationship, just trying to help me out. And he made a point of telling me that he's friends with married women and their husbands, too. He finally left me alone after saying over and over again that he wasn't trying to be weird. Too late. I left and never went back to that Starbucks again. I thought that would be the end of it, and I'd never have to see him again, but I was wrong. He may not seem very creepy to you, but he gave off a very, very strange vibe that's kind of hard to explain. So the following Friday, I went to Target. The Target is in the same shopping center as that Starbucks, but I hadn't seen the guy, so I felt safe. I got bored and decided to sit outside to wait for my boyfriend. That was my mistake. I should have stayed inside. I was sitting on a bench in front of the store when I saw someone out of the corner of my eye walking towards me. I glanced up and realized it was him. In a panic, I texted my friend and asked him to call me. I thought of going back inside, but the guy was blocking the way. He stopped by the doors and just stood there for a good 5 minutes looking around before going inside. I was telling my friend to hurry up and call me, but he was in the middle of something and said he'd call in 2 minutes. As I was waiting, I saw the guy coming back again towards me. He had only been inside for like a minute. He walked past me, turned around, then walked back and came up to me, making me very nervous. He made some excuse to talk to me. He said, "Hello." I said hi, without even looking up from the phone. Then he said, "May I ask you something?" I said with all the attitude I could muster, "What?" "I'm new in town, and I was looking for, never mind, sorry," and walked away. Thankfully, by that time, my friend called, and we stayed on the line for a good 45 minutes, during which time the guy seemed to completely disappear. I said to my friend that if he's still around when my boyfriend comes, then he would handle it. Since my boyfriend just joined the Navy, he would not be dumb enough to put his hands on the guy and get in trouble. But he is very tall and muscular, so I'm sure he'd scare the crap out of him. My friend finally had to go, and as soon as we hung up, and I mean literally the second we hung up, the creepy guy walked past me again. He hadn't left at all, but was waiting right out of sight, listening to my conversation. It was 3:26 p.m., and my boyfriend got off of work at 3:30, so I texted him, and I told him where I was and that the Starbucks creep was back again, and that I was going to call him at exactly 3:30 and to please pick up. He answered and I told him what happened, and he said that he was coming to get me. I had my boyfriend stay on the phone with me until he got there because I was scared. And the creepy guy was standing just out of sight again, listening. I made sure to call my boyfriend honey and baby multiple times because I knew the guy was listening. Next thing I knew, he was walking away over to Starbucks. When my boyfriend arrived, he was ready to give a verbal beatdown to this guy. But of course, the coward was nowhere to be found. I vowed never to go to that shopping area alone again. But even when I was with someone else, he still bothered me. I saw him again a few months later, and he followed my mother and me around Target with a hat covering his face, as if I wouldn't recognize him. I haven't seen him since, and it's been a few years now, So, Starbucks stalker, let's not ever meet again, or I guarantee you'll regret it.
Where I live is a small town, Brentwood, California, not where O.J. Simpson had his puzzling trial. We have an area code and around 50,000 residents, so you could say I lived in a small town. You kind of know everyone here. The mom of three you just saw in Ultra is now at Safeway. That's how small we are. But this is about my old crossing guard from my middle and high school. Middle school was about 4 years ago, and the crossing guard was always very weird. Now, I didn't walk home, but every morning and every evening, he was there yelling at kids to not cross. My mother and I looked over one day to find him scratching his nether regions around the children. Then, soon after, his whole head and face was shaved. Before, he had all his hair, even a mustache. You could say that he looked like Ron Swanson from Parks and Recreation. Just seemed odd, and I'm not one to judge people. People are people. We all have a special little thing about ourselves. But then he was gone, out of nowhere. He was gone by 8th grade year, which was still middle school where I live, and I was kind of relieved though. He kept getting weirder until he left. I'm now a sophomore in junior high school and saw him today at the Safeway Starbucks. Nothing odd really, just a small town, but it's just odd. I ordered a regular coffee for my mother and a frappe for myself, and while waiting for my drink, he stared me down. I'm 15 years old, 5 foot, curvy, and get a lot of looks. I look older than I really am, got up quick to fill the coffee with some cream, and I could see him looking at my ass in the glass wall they had. He didn't take his eyes off me until I turned around to look. So I'm waiting for my frappe, and he gets up and shouts while looking at me. I jumped in my seat from fear, and he goes to ask for more ice at the pickup area, and they politely declined, as he had asked before. I know you're thinking, this doesn't seem right, but then I see my drink is ready and I go to grab it. He's still waiting there even though they said no, and I grab a straw and walk away to tell my mum who's getting groceries. She remembers him all too well and wasn't surprised by the events that had happened. We walk around still, and soon leave after about an hour, and he's still there. As we pull out of the parking lot, there he is staring at my mother and I, very focused on us, and my mother looks over after a few seconds, and then looks away whistling. This guy might just be a simple middle-aged man, but it takes a lot to get me creeped out, but he was able to do it. I hope I never encounter him again. He really freaked me out.
When I was 16, I worked in a coffee shop. It was my very first job, and I really liked working there. I would occasionally get a creepy comment from some random old guy, but I tolerated it because I really needed the paycheck. But this one time, it went way too far. I worked from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., and those were long, feverish hours. There were 2 stations that you had to switch between, one for coffee and pastries, and one for ice cream. So I would spend long hours going back and forth between the 2 stations. I often worked with a girl in her early 20s named Kelly. She was really pretty, but despite her age, she had the maturity level of a 14-year-old. She wasn't much help at work, despite being my supervisor. She made me do all the work and expected me to split my tips with her 50-50. For about a week, I noticed the same guy coming in on the regular. He'd bring his laptop, order a green tea, and then sit and browse the internet for hours. I didn't pay any attention to him at first, but by the 3rd day in a row of him coming in, he made small talk with me at the counter. He asked me my name because I wasn't wearing my name tag. I told him my name, and he smiled and said he knew my mother. I fake smiled back and talked all giddy with my customer service voice. Then, in kind of a creepy way, he asked me how old I was. That made me uncomfortable, so instead of answering, I told him I needed to check something in the back room. I went in the back and I told Kelly that this guy was being creepy and asked if she could take care of him. She told me I was just being paranoid, but did me a solid anyway. I waited in back for about 10 minutes before going to the counter, and when I did, I found Kelly and this guy laughing and talking like they were old friends. He seemed to be flirting with her a lot, and then he looked up and saw me. He gave me a really creepy smile, winked at me, then turned to leave. I was disgusted, but decided to just get on with my work. The next day, he was back again. He ordered the same tea and sat down. I'm sorta nosy, so I walked over to the ice cream area where I could get a look at his laptop screen. He was looking at some girl's Facebook photos, and she looked very young, younger than me even. He clicked on pictures of her in bathing suits and just stared at them. It was all very creepy, but I forced myself to ignore it. He came back again the next day and did the usual thing, but this time I didn't look at his laptop screen. By 5 p.m., he was still sitting there. He usually would have left by then, and even Kelly noticed it. He came up to the counter and I walked over to assist him. He asked for a cup of boiling water for some medication he claimed to be on. To get to the water, I had to turn around, and I was wearing leggings and did not want to give this guy a show. So I backed up, got the water, and walked back to him. He seemed very disappointed that I hadn't turned around. As he picked up the water, he said to me, "Those leggings look a little tight on you. Are they tight?" I just stared at him. He laughed and said he was only joking, and he walked back to his laptop. I went into the back and told Kelly and asked her to kick the guy out, but she refused, and she said he was just being nice. I got upset with her and went back to the counter, but I was too scared to tell him to leave myself. He ended up staying there for the entire day. At 10 p.m., I grabbed the keys and locked the doors. The doors are locked from the outside, but you can still open the inside door to get out. This is a way to let customers know that we're closing. But this guy didn't make a move to leave. He asked me what high school I went to, but I ignored him and walked behind the counter. I shut off a couple of lights to signal again that we were closed. At that point, Kelly came to the front and she saw that he was still there, but she still didn't kick him out even then. She made small talk with him at the counter and let him sample the ice cream. He offered her a small round thing that looked like a pill, but he claimed was a mint. She declined. I overheard the conversation he and Kelly were having. He asked her what high school she went to. She laughed and said that she was 22 years old. He said, "Oh, I thought you were 15. Kelly didn't laugh at that one. I was incredibly disgusted, so I grabbed my purse and left. I walked out to my mom's car and I told her about the weird guy as we drove away. My mom doesn't tolerate that kind of thing, so she turned around and pulled back into the parking lot. She asked me if the white truck was his. I said yes, and she told me to stay in the car. But before she could do anything, he came walking out. He saw us, smiled and waved, and started walking over to us. My mom pulled out of the parking lot and drove away, telling me that she knew the guy. My mother works at a bank, and he's a customer there. She said he's always asking her out despite knowing that she's married, and he makes very inappropriate comments to her. My mom has a framed picture of me on her desk, and customers can see it. He must have seen it, found me on Facebook, and found out where I worked. We called the police when we got home and told them all about the guy. They said they were looking for him and they'd call us back. Well, they found him pretty easily and arrested him, but not for harassment. They arrested him because he was already banned from the property for a full year, and he shouldn't have been there in the first place. So, to the creepy guy who stalked both me and my mother, let's hope for your sake that we never meet again.
This happened a year ago, when we were on a mall having a good time. But there was about 7 of us. 6 of us were 14 and one of them 13. These details will be important for later. Many of my friends had started to leave. I was alone with the 13-year-old that was a relatively new friend. It was getting late and almost 10, and because of this we decided to go grab a coffee. So we went to grab one as we waited for our parents. Well, we're not the only ones. The Starbucks was still full of people. I said to her to just stay outside and there were some tables where we could sit. The line was slow and the coffees were ready in 15 minutes. They were understaffed because the place was about to close. I go outside and see a grown man, who seemed overweight, in the same table almost touching my friend. She was quite uncomfortable with the situation. I'm not very tall, but I'm a bit overweight, with a lot of my weight concentrated on my legs. He was still a fair bit taller than me. As I approached, we engaged in conversation. "Who are you?" "I'm her boyfriend." The guy then laughed in a way that made my blood boil. "How can you be interested in something like him? He's a kid. You need an adult." Now, I'm gonna be honest. This really pissed me off. I wouldn't say I'm handsome, 4 out of 10 perhaps, but she stood up and backed away from him, and told him to leave her alone. I couldn't comprehend why this guy was coming after her. She was so visibly underage. Then a barista came out of Starbucks and just stared at us. I felt confident in that moment to give him a really stern kick to the balls as he was distracted, and then we legged it to the parking lot to wait for our parents there instead. We became closer friends after that. She's been through some stuff, but it still annoys me that these older creeps really think that they're gonna get lucky with a 13-year-old girl. I mean, how perverse can you be?
A couple of years ago, I had my mom drive me to our local Starbucks. I wanted to spend a couple of hours there working on my laptop just to get out of the house. At the time, I was about to turn 18, but I look even younger for my age, making the whole encounter even more strange. I sat there working, not talking to anyone. Then an older couple, I'd say in their 70s, walked in and sat at a table near me. They talked to each other for a few minutes, and then the man went up to the counter to order. When he did, his wife turned around and asked me how to connect to the Wi-Fi. So, being a nice person, I went over and showed her how. She thanked me, and I went back to my seat. Then the man came back with 3 mugs of coffee. He spoke quietly to the woman. Then the woman turned around and insisted that I take one of the coffees because, quote, they ordered one too many. Uh-huh. How does a thing like that happen? I remained polite, but in my head, I was thinking about all the murder shows I've ever watched on TV and just how by the book this whole thing was. I said thank you and took the coffee, but I didn't drink it. They left me alone for a little while, but eventually struck up a conversation with me again. I played along, mostly because I knew my mother was coming, since we'd agreed that I'd only be there for 2 hours. They started talking about how great young people are, and how I should share a bottle of wine with them at their rented mansion in town. I laughed and told them that it wouldn't be appropriate because I was under the drinking age, and they made a joke about how I could just drink soda then. At that point, I was rather amazed that my jaw didn't hit the floor, because they were clearly pulling some sort of game on me, and it was so obvious and creepy. The man told me that he was a famous sportsman or some such nonsense. Then the woman insisted that I must visit them and that they would love to have my phone number so they could call me. I lied and told him I didn't have a phone, which, looking back, was kinda stupid. So the woman said she'd write down her address and cell number for me so I'd have it. I handed her my journal because it was the only paper I had on me, and she began writing her information inside. As this was happening, my mom walked in and immediately sensed the creepiness of the entire situation. She spoke to the couple, feigning polite conversation, all the while using her "I know what you're up to" voice. I was very pleased to see just how uncomfortable they suddenly became. We left shortly after, and though I had her information, I never really did anything with it. My mom tried to look them up online but couldn't find anything. So much for him being a famous sportsman. I still have that journal, but I haven't written more than 3 pages in it since that encounter because it brings up the bad memories. I mean, when does a couple in their 70s and an 18-year-old ever have enough in common that they would want to get together for drinks socially? And I can't believe they tried that whole extra drink thing. I don't know why they would try to drug me in a public place, but any way you look at it, that whole thing was skeevy. I'd like to thank Mortis for this collaboration. I truly appreciate it, and it's always fun working with him. If you'd like to hear more stories from me, jump on over to my channel by either clicking the screen above or clicking on the link in the description below. Have a great night, and once again, thank you, Mortis. You're a star.